When you woke up this morning, did you sharpen your stylus and prepare your clay tablet to take to school? Did your mom order the slaves to cook you breakfast? On your way to school, did you pass an ox-drawn cart bringing in produce from outside the city walls? For that matter, does your city have city walls? Of course not, because you don't live in ancient Sumer. In fact, your way of life and the way of life of people all over the world is much different than the life of ancient Sumerians because, well, that was a long time ago. And sometimes it's easy to forget that things change over time. For example, different groups of people can control the same area of land at different points in history. And that's what we're talking about today. The people who took control of the Fertile Crescent after the Sumerians lost power. Hello everybody. While the Sumerians were a huge influence in Mesopotamia for a long time, eventually they did lose power, which opened up the region of Mesopotamia to conflicts and other people taking power of the region. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Some would create empires. By the way, let's talk about empires and kingdoms for a minute. Kingdoms and empires are different. A kingdom is where a government or a king rules over one group of people. An empire is a situation where a government or a king or an emperor has control over many different groups of people. And we're going to take a look at some examples of that in just a moment. Let's take a look at this timeline. You can see it starts in 3000 BC with the Sumerians. Now, if you're doing the math, and I know you are, you take 3000 BC, that's 3000 years before Christ. You've got, today is 2012, give or take a couple years. So you've got 3,000 years before Christ plus 2012 years after. That's 5,012 years ago. I know, a long time, right? And in that time, those 5,012 years, many different groups of people have had control over Mesopotamia. As I've said, the Sumerians eventually lost control of Mesopotamia, and the group that took over after the Sumerians were called the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans were neighbors to the north of Sumer, and they were good neighbors for a long time. Until this guy here took over. His name was Sargon the First. He moved the capital of the Chaldeans, built a new city called Akkad. Sargon was the first ruler to have a permanent army with professional soldiers, and he used this army to create an empire that spread from the Persian Gulf in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. It was huge. It conquered all the Sumerian city-states. And he had the world's first empire. It's an empire because he not only ruled over Akkadians, he also ruled over Sumerians and other groups of people who lived in the Fertile Crescent. A century after Sargon's death, his empire fell apart, and eventually the Sumerians took back control of Mesopotamia, and the city-state of actually became very powerful. Constant attacks from the outside, though, drained Ur's resources, and eventually the Sumerians lost control of the region again, which led to a lot of fighting from other people trying to take control of the region. One of these groups of people were called the Babylonians, and by 1800 BC they gained a huge influence over Mesopotamia. One of their most famous kings is Hammurabi. Hammurabi conquered all of Mesopotamia. He did a lot of great things, including improving tax collection, improving trade for the region, not to mention conquering all that land. But the thing he is most known for is his code of laws. Remember, a law is a rule set by the government that people have to follow. Hammurabi did not create the first laws, but what he did was he took laws from his city and neighboring cities and compiled them into one set of laws. This set of laws is called Hammurabi's Code, and what he did was he put it onto an 8-foot tall stone slab. And he put that slab right in the middle of the city so that everybody could read it. One has to wonder, if not everybody could read, how beneficial it was to have all the laws written in the middle of the city. There were 282 laws. If you wanted to see the original stone slab, it is still around today, and it's housed in the Louvre in Paris, France. So 282 laws, and they dealt with almost all parts of daily life. For example, there were laws that would tell you what would happen if your neighbor flooded your field. There were laws dealing with how people could divorce each other. There were laws about what would happen to a waitress who overcharges for beer. So these laws covered all aspects of daily life. And while the punishments may seem harsh, there was a lot of death penalty, there was a lot of eye-poking outing, and there was a lot of tossing people into rivers. There are things from Hammurabi's code that influence our law codes today. For example, Hammurabi's code introduces the idea of being tried before you are found guilty of a crime. It also introduces the idea that specific crimes have specific punishments. One big difference between Hammurabi's code and legal codes today is that the laws were different based on which social status you were a part of. For example, punishments were much harsher for slaves than they were for priests. After Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian Empire lost power, and by 1595, another group had control of Babylon. The name of this group were the Hittites, and their advantage came from technology. They were the first group of people to use iron in building their weapons. Iron is much stronger than bronze, so their weapons were much stronger than Babylonian weapons. Also, they were the first group of people to use chariots in battle. Technology is always important, and these two technological advances gave the Hittites a distinct advantage over their rivals. Of course, they couldn't escape the fact that their king was killed by an assassin, and the Kassites took over shortly after that. Kassites would rule for 400 years, and then yet another group would take control of Mesopotamia. This group of people were called the Assyrians. The Assyrians would create an empire even bigger than Sargon's. They took control of Babylon in 900, and by 1200 they started to expand over the rest of Mesopotamia. Now the Assyrians were scary, and they were masters of intimidation. By 652 they started fighting against each other to see who would control the empire, and this opened them up to attack. The Assyrians were conquered by a group of people called the Chaldeans, the Chaldean Empire. Apparently it's Chaldean, stupid English language always tripping me up. Sometimes this is also called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Their most famous king is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world. He also built the Gate of Ishtar, which you can see right here, and really rebuilt Babylon into a more beautiful city. The Chaldean Empire included Babylonia, Assyria, northern Arabia, Phoenicia. The Phoenicians! How could I forget about the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians lived in western Mesopotamia along the Mediterranean Sea. Phoenicia would have been where current-day Lebanon is today. And they were very interested in trade, especially because they had a lot of cedar lumber, which was a very valuable resource. However, trading over the land was difficult because you had mountains and lots of people who wanted to kill you. So instead, they became expert sailors. By 800 BC, that's right, before the Chaldean Empire, the Phoenicians had set up a massive trade network across the Mediterranean Sea. They were expert sailors, and they set up colonies along the way, including Tyre and Carthage, 2 very important cities. One of the most important things the Phoenicians did was they were one of the first civilizations to create an alphabet where you had different symbols representing specific letters, and you could put those together to create words. So as you can see, a lot of different groups of people had control of the same general area of land at different times in history. In a typical world studies class, we tend to talk about places when they're at their peak, when the people there are doing their best. And then we tend to forget to talk about what happens after that peak. Things change over time. Empires rise, empires fall. And the purpose of this video was to illustrate that fact. In fact, if you remember this one simple point, things change over time, you're going to be ahead of the curve. Were you paying attention? Answer the next couple of questions to find out. Who was Hammurabi? Why is he important to us? Who were the Phoenicians? What did they do that affects us today? can use Mesopotamian history to show that things change over time.